You've probably seen this equation before. I remember personally in high school, they made me memorize this equation and I had no idea why. But now I realize that this equation is so important for life. This equation basically tells us how I take a fuel like glucose and I burn it in oxygen, and I produce some byproducts like carbon dioxide and water, but the main goal of this whole process is for me to get something called ATP, which is our body's energy currency. So basically this equation tells me how I take food energy, like from glucose, and convert it into energy that my body can actually use. This is going on all the time in your body, all over the cells of your body, and it's so important for sustaining life. So in this video, I'm going to give you an overview of how in particular we take glucose and go through these various steps, because this doesn't occur in one step, but the various steps that go on to take that glucose so I can get this ATP. That is our goal. That is what we typically mean when we talk about metabolism. Okay, so I'm going to break this down into 4 different steps. And I'll start with our first step, which is something called glycolysis, which technically means the breakdown, the lysis of glucose. And in this step, I take glucose, so C6H12O6, I'll just write glucose here, and I break it down into 2 molecules of pyruvate. Okay, pyruvate. Which pyruvate? Which is a 3-carbon structure. Okay, so this step produces a little bit of ATP, just a little bit in this process, about 2 molecules of ATP, and this can sustain us for a little bit. I don't need oxygen for this reaction to occur, and it happens pretty quickly in the cells, but this can sustain us for a bit, but not that long. What happens next is actually more important. And what happens next is the further breakdown of pyruvate. Okay, so step number 2, I just call the breakdown of pyruvate. Now, how pyruvate is actually broken down depends on whether there is enough oxygen present in the body. So you always have oxygen in the body, don't get me wrong, but sometimes the demands of our body are too high, or we don't have enough oxygen at the cells at the appropriate time in order to fully break down pyruvate further. These are called anaerobic conditions. So think of like when you're sprinting, or like when you're weightlifting, you're doing something really high intensity, or in the beginning of exercise, when your body's still figuring out where to send oxygen at the appropriate levels. That is something called an anaerobic condition, okay? And in this condition, so I'll just write pyruvate again, pyruvate is broken down into something called lactate. Lactate is the base, or lactic acid is its conjugate acid, okay? And in this process, I produce a little bit of ATP as well. Unfortunately, this is not sustainable for long. And it's one of the reasons why if you're sprinting, your legs feel really like burny. It's because this product builds up and it's something that our tissues do not like. Okay, but it can sustain us for a bit in these high energy demand type situations. Okay, so this is something called an anaerobic condition. So I'll write anaerobic. So another way to put that is that there's not enough oxygen available. Okay, but typically under most situations there is enough oxygen available, like right now just sitting there watching this video, or when you're going for a walk, or even when you're running at a sustainable rate, your body knows how to match oxygen needs with oxygen delivery. Okay, and that is something called an aerobic condition. So I'll write aerobic. Okay, so there is enough oxygen available to meet the needs of the body. And in this case, pyruvate is broken down into something called acetyl-CoA. Okay, coenzyme A enters the equation, and I can make something called acetyl-CoA. Just as a side note, when I am using my anaerobic processes, the good news is that this process is reversible. So when oxygen becomes available again, that lactate can become pyruvate again, and then that pyruvate can proceed down that acetyl-CoA pathway. So think about, like, again, let's say when you're sprinting and then you start walking it out afterwards, that burny sensation goes away as you start using that lactate to get back to pyruvate and into acetyl-CoA. Okay? So that's the second stage of what we call cellular respiration. Okay, an important metabolic process that, again, is going to help me break down, in this case, a fuel to get ATP. Okay, the third stage of cellular respiration is something called the citric acid cycle. This is also called the Krebs cycle. This is also called the tricarboxylic acid cycle, just to be confusing. And if you take biochemistry, you get to learn all the various steps and all the various enzymes that are involved in this process, but we're going to keep it super simple in this basic nutrition course. Okay? So in order for acetyl-CoA to enter the citric acid cycle, it combines with something called oxaloacetate. Okay, which is derived from carbohydrate intermediates. Okay, so oxaloacetate and acetyl-CoA come together to form something called citrate. Okay, and that's actually where the citric acid cycle, all right, 3 citric acid cycle, that's actually where the citric acid cycle gets its name, from this product. Now, there are many steps in between. This is a cycle, and what happens is that this product gets modified, and various intermediates are formed to eventually actually get it back to oxaloacetate. But the important thing is that while citrate is being changed into all these different intermediates, for one thing, some energy is released and captured as something called GTP, which is kind of like ATP, but it doesn't have a different base. And actually, more importantly, I release some electrons in this process, which are picked up by our electron transporters, NADH plus H plus, and something called FADH2. These are my electron transporters. So honestly, the main goal of this citric acid cycle, in order to get us to ATP, is for us to pick up electrons via these electron transporters, because these electron transporters are going to carry those electrons to the last stage of cellular respiration. So here we go to the last stage. Okay, so stage 4 of cellular respiration is something called the electron transport chain. And this happens at the membrane of the mitochondria of the cell. Okay, and along that mitochondrial membrane, we have all these membrane-bound proteins. And what happens is these electron transporters drop off electrons to these membrane-bound proteins, then they pick them up from there, then they bounce back to them. There's a series of what we call redox reactions, or reduction and oxidation reactions. Okay, the loss of electrons, the gain of electrons, loss of electrons, gain of electrons. And all of this process, this bouncing around of electrons, eventually drives a pump that is going to allow me to synthesize ATP. It's a little more complex than that, but just for simplicity's sake, this whole bouncing of around of electrons allows for the activation of something called ATP synthase, which eventually is going to help me synthesize ATP from its precursor. Okay? So all of this process was just to get me from glucose, a fuel, the fuel that we eat, to our body's energy currency, a type of fuel my cells can actually use, my muscles can use to contract, my cells can use to pump things in and out of. Okay? But you might be wondering, you just talked about glucose. You also know that lipids and proteins can also be used for fuel. Well, don't worry, I'm not going to draw out a whole other series of reactions. Once you know this basic understanding of cellular respiration, you can then realize that lipids and proteins can come into this process as well. Okay, so for instance, and I'll just do it here because it's the easiest place to do it. If you remember, when it comes to our lipids, the main type of lipid is something called a triglyceride, which has 3 fatty acids and a glycerol molecule. Okay, that glycerol molecule can be used to make glucose, and then go through the process as we talked about. Okay? Those fatty acid molecules, I'll just draw it like this, are clipped off 2 carbons at a time through a process called beta oxidation to form actually acetyl-CoA. And then acetyl-CoA goes to the citric acid cycle. We pick up electrons. They go onto the electron transport chain. That drives this ATP synthesis. Okay? So that's how our lipids, and in particular our triglycerides, can also go into this process. Okay? As far as proteins go, you'll recall that the basic structure of a protein is something called an amino acid. Okay, so here's my amino acid. And if you'll remember about our amino acids, actually we haven't talked about amino acids yet, but you'll learn about amino acids, that there's 20 different amino acids, and what makes each amino acid different is what its side chain looks like. They all have this basic structure, but they have a different side chain. Now, in order to enter this whole process, that amino group is clipped off, and depending on what's left over, that remaining amino acid structure can come into the cycle at different points in time. So for instance, certain amino acids can be used to make citric acid cycle intermediates. Certain amino acids can be used to make pyruvate. And again, it proceeds through this process. So to recall, that was quite complex, and I encourage you reviewing it several times, but the big idea is how do we get our food energy and convert it into cellular energy? We do this by going through this process of cellular respiration. And I showed you how we break down glucose as kind of the template of how we break down all of these different types of nutrients, of energy yielding nutrients.